Peter B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Wednesday, November 8th, 2017. Yeah, it's been a year. A year of dealing with the Trump problem. And the question arises, does the First Amendment protect a citizen's right to flip the bird at the presidential motorcade? And the question is a serious one because Julie Briskman was working for a government contractor in the Washington, D.C. area. She lives in Virginia, not far from one of Trump's golf properties. And as the motorcade was rolling by, she was on her bicycle, and you've probably seen the picture. You see Julie from her backside as she extends her middle digit at the presidential limousine. And the picture was captured by news photographers. Julie Briskman says she was a little surprised, but once she saw the photograph, she put it up on Facebook as her profile picture. And then when she went to work the next day, she said, by the way, that was me. And the following day, her boss called her in and told her she was being terminated for violating the company, which is Acoma LLC, a government contractor, their policy on social media. And I find this deeply offensive. And today in the Washington Post, the labor expert, Professor Benjamin Sachs from the Harvard Law School, he put up a column that I fully agree with. Now, he knows more about the law and judicial precedents, but fundamentally, I believe that flipping the bird is an expression of dismissal, rejection, outrage, anger. And yeah, it means fuck you. But it is coded in a way that I think is protected speech. And what's interesting is, sometime back at Acoma, Julie Briskman discovered that one of her colleagues, in her view, had violated the social media policy. And I believe his comments, I couldn't find them with a quick search, but when I read about this before, I think that his comments had been racist, or at least had a racist tone to them. But he didn't get fired. He was permitted to scrub his social media post, Facebook or Twitter, I'm not sure which. And Professor Sachs says that under the law, there are some interesting precedents, and that in the era of Trump, he explicitly says, given Trump's repeated decision to insert politics into private sector workplace disputes, and he talks about Trump's demonization of the union president at Carrier Corporation's plant in Indianapolis, also the dust-up over the NFL and Trump's demand that owners fire players who take a knee. Well, given these actions, Professor Sachs says it's time for courts to offer heightened protection for private sector employees' political activities. If the president can tweet about workers, then workers must be able to tweet, remark on, and yes, flip off the president. And protecting these rights means that employers must not be able to fire workers who engage in these political acts. And it's interesting because the other night I dropped by my Republican neighbor Hank's house. The Monday Night Football was on, and the conversation drifted to the national anthem protests. And Hank is quite a patriot. I don't disrespect him for his position. But he's adamant that these players do not have the right. He says it's a violation of NFL rules and that employers do have the right to tell you how to act when you're on the job. And I think that it's difficult to define a stadium as a workplace. But it is for the paid players who are there. And I believe even in that workplace, they have the right to express themselves. They're not stopping anybody else from standing and putting a hand over a heart and singing along with the national anthem. They are simply opting out. And I believe that the First Amendment does defend or protect that kind of expression. And Professor Sachs talks about a decision regarding a guy who worked for Nationwide Insurance. This goes back to 1983. An employee who was discharged after he refused to participate in a lobbying effort on his employer's behalf. He was fired, he sued, and the court reasoned that public policy could be derived from the First Amendment, that the First Amendment protects political freedom, and therefore that actions taken by employers that significantly impinge on political freedoms can violate public policy. So I think it's a strong argument, but in the era of Trump, I'm not sure it will ever get a fair hearing. Also in the era of Trump, we have media organizations that abandon journalistic principles to promote their conspiracy theories regarding Trump. And yesterday, I spent quite a bit of time at the beginning of the News and Comment podcast talking about Bill Binney, the former NSA technical director, who has been a whistleblower, a courageous and honorable one, a man I deeply respect and give the ultimate credibility to. I've reached out to Bill to see if I can schedule a fresh interview with him, and I hope to bring that to you in the next few days. But there are so many examples of yellow journalism where the purpose of the article is to smear Bill Binney, to diminish or dismiss his theory about the DNC leak versus a Russian hack job. And it's all designed to defend and promote the unproven conspiracy theories that Russia did hack the DNC, gave that stuff to WikiLeaks, and this was all part of a big plot to elect Trump and defeat Hillary. And I'm just going to cite one example from NBC, because they are the network that I think has consistently, and led by Rachel Maddow's nightly program on MSNBC, promoted this narrative that, as I've told you, is based on innuendo and leaks and anonymous sources that can't be publicly proven. And yet the narrative sticks, and the media takes the side of the intelligence community. These assessments that were issued in October and then this past January are taken as biblical, on biblical faith, by journalists who should be skeptical of everything, including Bill Binney. But listen to this. Ken Delanian writes a piece that's published on NBC News. It opens with, "At the urging of President Trump, CIA Director Mike Pompeo met last month with a former U.S. intelligence official who advocates a fringe theory that the hack of the Democrats during the election was an inside job and not the work of Russian intelligence." Now, this is loaded language. You could say an alternative theory. You could say a contradictory theory. But in the opening sentence, Ken Delanian seeks to identify Bill Binney as a wacko and that his ideas are equally crazy. And Bill Binney is a very serious man. I've talked to him at least a dozen times over the years. I know he is a conservative. It didn't surprise me that it's reported he voted for Trump. But that's irrelevant. A paragraph down, Delanian continues, and he has an inaccuracy here, because I'll correct that Bill Binney left the agency in 2001, but this article says it was 2000. Binney left the agency in 2000 and has become a self-styled whistleblower, making unsupported claims that the NSA is collecting and storing nearly every U.S. communication. These claims are not unsupported. Ed Snowden's documents helped confirm the allegations that have come from Bill Binney, Russell Tice, Tom Drake, and other NSA whistleblowers who I have personally interviewed. But NBC believes the intelligence community. And this is at the center of the problem. This is not journalism. It's not quite propaganda. But it is yellow journalism in service of the intelligence community. And their credibility is never questioned. If they say it, it must be true, despite the entire litany of events over the years where the CIA has lied, particularly about Russia. But NBC gives no notice to that. They instead reinforce, quote, the intelligence assessment concluded with high confidence that Russia sought to interfere in the 2016 presidential election, in part by hacking computers at the DNC and leaking embarrassing documents. One of the goals was to benefit Trump, the assessment said. The article continues. It is extremely unusual for a CIA director to meet with someone like Binney, who for years has accused U.S. intelligence agencies of subverting the Constitution and violating the civil rights of Americans. He has been feted in Europe and elsewhere as a truth-telling whistleblower, but American officials of all political persuasions say his allegations about the NSA are false. Now, this is where corporate media embraces a fascistic moment. By supporting the government here and by really marginalizing, mischaracterizing Bill Binney. Because his accusations, quote, that the U.S. intelligence agencies have been subverting the Constitution and violating the civil rights of Americans, are true. And the fact that NBC would attack Binney and not even examine these claims. All right? This is an article that is intended to get the true believers of NBC, of the Russiagate narrative, the Democratic Party, to just dismiss what Bill Binney has to say. And listen to this smear in the next paragraph. Making the meeting even more noteworthy is the fact that Binney, 74, has made frequent appearances on RT, Russia's state-funded broadcasting and internet news agency, which the CIA recently accused of acting as a propaganda arm for Russia, with the goal of undermining confidence in American democracy. That's McCarthyism, pure and simple. Bill Binney goes where he's invited. He's been on this show. He didn't examine my political perspectives before he agreed to talk to me. And a couple of paragraphs down, they add to the smear, oh, he's also been a frequent guest on Fox News and has often been cited by Breitbart News. Well, if NBC would invite him on any of their programs, and I dare Rachel Maddow to do it, he would offer a contradiction to the narrative that NBC is promoting. And the only accurate undermining of Bill Binney that appears is the final sentence in this article. The memo has since been disputed, even by some members of the group, including Thomas Drake, another NSA whistleblower. They're referring to the report, the memo that Bill Binney co-authored, and that was published by Ray McGovern and the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. And it did draw an objection, a minority report from Tom Drake and some of the other members. That's a legitimate discussion, and it's legitimate for NBC to report that. But the smears about RT, Fox, the implication that because Trump asked for the meeting, this is part of some strategy to, clear himself of charges that NBC has already convicted him of. And let's remember that it's NBC that created this monster. They gave Donald Trump a primetime platform for years with that awful reality show, The Apprentice. And, of course, they never acknowledged that. Donna Brazile is massaging the initial excerpt of her book that was published, which pretty clearly says that her view is that after she saw that memo that was signed in August of 2015 between the DNC and the Clinton campaign, that she concluded that, yes, the primary had been rigged against Bernie Sanders. And that term rigged is problematic. I would concede that. But now Brazile, I guess today she was on the Morning Joe show. She walked back her written claim that the party's primary contest was rigged in Hillary's favor. Brazile went so far as to say that she really didn't write any such thing, and that her book only appears to allege that the primary was rigged. Now, as you know, I don't have the highest confidence in Donna Brazile. She's been an establishment player since 2000 when she worked on the Al Gore campaign and an insider who had a sweet gig at CNN. And yes, she did lie about the fact that she supplied questions from CNN town halls or debates. She supplied those to the Clinton campaign. She lied about that for over a year. And now she's trying to say that what she wrote in her book is not quite what she means now. And I believe that she's been heavily threatened by many establishment Democrats close to the Clintons. But her fundamental claim in the book is that, yes, Debbie Wasserman Schultz was a tool of the Clintons. Yes, there was this agreement that I believe violates campaign finance laws, but the lawyers say, well, it's a gray area. But they never address the myriad issues about the scheduling of debates, about, just for one example, what happened in Nevada, where false claims that Sanders supporters threw chairs were amplified by Rachel Maddow and also promoted by Wasserman Schultz and her communications team at the DNC. And there are many other examples. And we hear Donna Brazile saying, well, you can't really rig the primary because each state runs its own election. But there are many factors like the distribution of the big donor money that came into the DNC and was fed right back out to support Hillary's digital marketing campaigns in critical primary states. And the fix of the superdelegates who were all locked down for Clinton and would not change their position despite the surge that Sanders showed. The polls showed that he could beat Trump and she couldn't. Yes, it was rigged. And no matter what Donna Brazile says tomorrow, I believe that. I have asked for a copy of her book, and maybe I'll get a chance to interview her. We will see. The Donald was in Seoul, South Korea last night, and he gave a speech that was interesting. He didn't fumble it as badly as he does most teleprompter speeches. And he actually, was relatively coherent. He was free of the bluster and the bombast of little rocket man and, I'm going to fire and brimstone you, whatever that phrase was. But he did set a number of arbitrary red lines that will haunt him in the future. And he believes that he can bluff and intimidate Kim Jong-un sufficiently to get him to shut down his nuclear program and stop launching missiles. One quote, "It is our responsibility and our duty to confront this danger together because the longer we wait, the greater the danger grows and the fewer the options become." But he's not admitting he really has no options. Our own military advised the Senate last week that the only way to really take out all of Kim Jong-un's potential nuclear weapons is a ground invasion and a full occupation of North Korea. And the idea that Trump would do that because of a threat, not because of an actual, launch of military action by North Korea, is really crazy. Another quote, "To those nations that choose to ignore this threat, or worse still, to enable it, the weight of this crisis is on your conscience." And he really was addressing Kim from the legislature there in Seoul, South Korea. One of the things that's interesting to me, and I've commented on this several times, is that back in August, the Beijing government quietly notified both the United States and North Korea that if North Korea attacked the United States, China would remain neutral. And if the United States attacks North Korea, China will come to the aid of North Korea. I believe that is checkmate. And, of course, Trump would never admit that. But I am surprised that our corporate media outlets have not commented on that. Trump is now in Beijing, being wined and dined and taken to an opera by Xi Jinping. And he dreams that he's got the leverage to force Xi to squeeze Kim by saying, hey, I'll lay off my threats about, trade sanctions or tariffs on Chinese products. Everybody knows that Trump is bluffing. But he believes his own bluffs, and he expects the rest of us to go along with that. Meanwhile, the White House is implementing the threatened restrictions on American travel to Cuba. You can only go in a licensed group. You can't stay at certain hotels that are linked to the government. And this is just another era of folly, driven by political pandering to the Cuban emigres, mostly in Miami, and the belief that we can use sanctions and economic threats to force the Cuban government to bend to our will and to, as Trump says, cut us a better deal. But for 60 years, embargoes, sanctions, and the isolation of Cuba only strengthened the control that the Castro brothers have had. And that's all that will happen in this case as well. Got a note from Faith Peoples, who is a loyal listener and a dedicated, generous subscriber to the Peter B. Collins podcast. And she said, the subject line reads, Russia, 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 skeptics. And she said, Peter, there are two public figures I haven't heard you mention who have been steadfast Russia skeptics. Brian Becker, with recent co-host John Kiriakou of Loud and Clear, and Eugene Puryear of By Any Means Necessary, both radio shows carried by Sputnik. And no, Faith, I'm not familiar with their work, but I will check them out. She closes by saying, I highly recommend these podcasts to Peter B. loyalists, and I'm glad that you're still with me, Faith, because just in the last 48 hours, I've lost 2 subscribers. Now, I don't know exactly why they canceled, but I have to suspect that it relates to my refusal to accept the consensus view, to submit to the orthodoxy, and the idea that we all have to sing from the same page. It's really sad to me that people are operating in this way. But you have the opportunity to support my work. And by the way, you don't have to agree with everything I say. Ann Bryant just renewed and upgraded her subscription. And she said, Peter, I listen to you a lot and I disagree with you a lot. And that's really what I want. If you just take what I say as gospel, I will say I don't have as much respect for you. So come on over to peterbcollins.com, pull on the menu button, click on the link that says Become a Subscriber, and you're there on the sign-up page where the options are displayed. I want to take a look at comparative coverage of the turmoil in the leadership in Saudi Arabia. And I've got 3 selections for you. They're all linked in the show file for today's podcast. I start with the New York Times, which in its latest article, published on November 7th, focuses on the claim that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS as he is tagged, is focused on eliminating corruption in the royal kingdom. And the Times airs out the questions about whether, there really are any standards, that self-dealing is a way of life in Saudi Arabia, and that because the whole country is owned lock, stock, and barrel by the House of Saud, it's kind of difficult for outsiders to figure out whether this crackdown is real, it's justified. But the Times doesn't go beyond the issues related to the alleged corruption. Well, it's not alleged. I think we can say it's real. And that is the motivation of MBS. Then we go to Haaretz, the liberal Israeli newspaper, and they ask, is Saudi Arabia pushing Israel into war with Hezbollah and Iran? They note that the international oil markets dropped on Monday after the announcement of the roundup of at least 11 royal princes who are now locked up at the Ritz-Carlton. I mean, if you got to do time, it ain't Gitmo. The price of oil, by the way, is rising slowly. It's up to $57 today. Anyway, back to Saudi Arabia and the Haaretz angle. Analysts say the arrests were another preemptive measure by the Crown Prince to remove powerful figures as he exerts control over the world's leading oil exporter. The roundup recalls the palace coup in June, through which he ousted his elder cousin, Mohammed bin Nayef, as heir to the throne and interior minister. They also note that Prince Mohammed, rather than forging alliances, is extending his iron grip to the ruling family, the military, and the National Guard to counter what appears to be more widespread opposition within the family, as well as the military, to his reforms and the war in Yemen. But for the deep dirt and the dirty lowdown, I turn to our pal Pepe Escobar at Asia Times, and he's got quite an angle on this. He talks about the anti-corruption commission that was set up, and moments later they rounded up at least 11 princes and locked them at the Ritz. And back in July, Pepe Escobar had anticipated this kind of infighting in the House of Saud. And he cites an unnamed Middle East businessman investment source who's been doing deals for decades with the House of Saud. Quote, "This is more serious than it appears. The arrest of 2 sons of previous King Abdullah, Princes Maiteb and Turkey, was a fatal mistake. This now endangers the king himself. It was only the regard for the king that protected his son Mohammed. There are many left in the army against MBS, and they are enraged at the arrest of their commanders." And to say the Saudi Arabian army is in uproar is an understatement. He'd have to arrest the whole army before he could feel secure. Now, there is more in Pepe Escobar's piece, and I invite you to follow the link and read it, because he predicts that the turmoil and that attempted coups and counter-coups will continue for the foreseeable future. And it could lead to regime change that may bring someone to power who's not that friendly with the United States. Over at The Intercept, Li Feng is noting that members of Congress, members of both parties of Congress, are doing their best to avoid taking a vote under the War Powers Act on U.S. military involvement in Yemen. Now, we've been there for years, and we claim that the 2001 authorization for use of military force, the blank check given to Bush after 9/11, somehow covers the war in Yemen, because there's a group that calls itself Al-Qaeda there that wasn't even formed at the time the AUMF was written. But it turns out that Al-Qaeda is fighting on the same side as the United States in Yemen. Nevertheless, we've got Steny Hoyer, number 2 Democrat in the House, who collaborated with Republicans to change the designation of H-Con Res 81. And 81 was considered to be a privileged bill, meaning that it had to go to the floor and had to get a vote. But quietly, lawmakers on November 1st stripped the bill of its privileged status. It may get a vote, but it's been sent back to a committee where it is expected to die. In Virginia last night, Democrats had a very good night. Lieutenant Governor Ralph Northam was elected governor by a significant margin, 9 percentage points over Ed Gillespie. And Trump backed Gillespie until he lost, and then he said, well, he's a loser. And there's some interesting things here. A lot of Democrats and people who don't pay close attention think that this is the start of a wave. It's an interesting development, and with the victory in New Jersey that was widely expected, Democrats pick up 1 governorship, and I guess there are now 30 Republicans and 20 Democrats who are governors in the U.S. But in Virginia, a transgender person named Danica Rome, R-O-E-M, age 33, She defeated Bob Marshall, a Republican who was running for his 14th term, who has bragged about being the most homophobic member of the legislature in Virginia. He introduced a bill this year that would have barred transgender students from using the bathroom of their choice. And during the campaign, he repeatedly used male pronouns to refer to Ms. Rome. We also saw that Virginians elected the man who had watched his girlfriend, who was a television reporter, get shot and killed on a live TV morning show. His name is Chris Hurst. He was a news anchor at the same station, and I believe he was actually back at the studio anchoring the report when his girlfriend, Allison Parker, was shot and killed on air. And he ran against an NRA-backed member of the state legislature, and he won. It's also notable that Justin Fairfax, an African-American, was elected lieutenant governor despite the fact that some Democrats pulled their support for him, I think partly because of racial considerations, but it was because, at least on the face of it, that he was critical of two proposed natural gas pipelines running through the state of Virginia. I guess that's a little too progressive for the Democratic Party there, but I'm glad to see he prevailed. We got a problem here right in my own backyard. I've railed against the private prisons that detain people who are held on immigration charges. And in Contra Costa County, which is just to the east of me, it's a fairly large geographical area, mostly white, the county leases space in their jail to ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And I want to credit Otis R. Taylor, Jr., the dreadlocked columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle, who has exposed the ugly conditions and treatment, particularly of women inmates, who are told that they've got to hold it or pee or poop in a plastic bag because they're not let out of their cells more than 4 hours a day. This is a $6 million contract that the county has, and the official says, oh, we didn't know anything about that. But I'm glad to see it exposed, and I hope it gets fixed right away. One woman was so despondent about the conditions, she begged to be deported rather than continue to be locked up there. Yesterday, I reported that the Walt Disney Company had issued a ban of LA Times movie critics getting preview screenings of Disney releases. It was a really dumb move because the newspapers give free publicity to the movie industry. But the Disney Company was pissed about coverage in the Times of its relationship with the town of Anaheim, which is where Disneyland is located. And after other prominent film critics announced they would boycott Disney films, Disney recognized that it had shot itself right in the foot. And another reversal at Notre Dame, where the Jesuit leadership had issued a memo on October 27th saying that they would no longer provide insurance, health insurance, that included free coverage for contraception. The University of Notre Dame, as a Catholic institution, follows Catholic teaching about the use of contraceptives, recognizing, however, the plurality of religious and other convictions among its students. It will not interfere with the provision of contraceptives that will be administered and funded independently by the university. Well, that's a bit of a victory. But we're going to see a lot of other cases where companies claiming a religious exemption refuse to allow contraception as part of their health insurance policies. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. It's free, and you're free to share it all over the place. You can also find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.